Hi, my name is Vasilisa. Welcome to my channel about brain research. The brain consists of different structures, and each of them has a particular role in the functioning of our body, in our psyche, and our behavior. Historically, it happens that a lot of things that we know today about the brain came from pathologies. For example, there was a patient who had a dysfunction. This patient was studied by a group of doctors and researchers. And by the end, this group of researchers and doctors found out that the reason of his dysfunction is a damage to a specific brain structure. And then they can conclude that this structure is involved in a specific function. So today we with Dr. Sheldon Benjamin will regard one of these specific medical cases. We will talk about GP and the nature of social behavior. Dr. Sheldon Benjamin is a highly recognized American neurologist, neuropsychiatrist, and psychiatrist who contributed a lot in the understanding of human behavior and education in neuropsychiatry. So, Dr. Benjamin, this is an honor for me to have you here. Thank you that you could join and share your results about GP story.
Thank you, Vasilisa.
First of all, I have a question. It passed already about 45 years since GP died. So why did you decide to come back to his story and to reinvestigate it?
Well, in 2016 or so, I was working with colleagues to create a reference about what we considered to be the most important case histories in the history of neuropsychiatry. Neuropsychiatry, the gray zone between neurology and psychiatry that involves the association of brain with behavior. And we made a list of a number of possible cases, case reports. These are people, not and then we interviewed 10 very well-known medical historians, behavioral neurologists, neuropsychologists, neuropsychiatrists, and asked what they thought of our list, and we whittled it down to 6. And on that list was a patient named JP. Back in 1984 or so, when I was a neurology resident, or possibly when I was a behavioral neurology fellow the next year in Boston, one of my teachers said, given your interest, I was interested in the frontal lobes at that time and what the possible functions of the frontal lobes were. He says, given your interest, have you read the story of JP? And he gave me a reference to a paper that had been published in 1948 and by a doctor named Spafford Ackerley working with a neuropsychologist named Arthur Benton. And the paper was incredible. I had never read anything like it, because not only did it have the medical workup, but it had everything they could know about the childhood, the growing up, the parents, the behavior, the school reports, everything they could discover about this patient, and attempted to correlate it with what they were able to do in the early or part of the 20th century to understand the part of the brain that was dysfunctional. And then Dr. Ackerley wrote a follow-up paper in 1964, giving even more information about JP in adulthood. And I knew this case. Mm-hmm. And so I argued that it should be part of our paper. And so we picked 6 cases. JP was one of them. But in the process of researching primary sources, because we were trying to study only the primary sources, not the reports that had been kind of passed down like a game of telephone over the generations. When we began to study it, I got quite interested in this case because I knew, based on reading Dr. Ackerley's papers from back then, that he would have done an autopsy. He always studied the brains of his patients when they were important. He had studied neurology as well as psychiatry and child psychiatry. He was a very good clinician. And there's no question, even one of the papers, he said, eventually we will show the pathology in this case, yet it was never published. So when we finished the first paper in maybe 2015 or 16, I started to search for the brain of JP to find out if he ever had an autopsy, because it wasn't in the medical literature. There was
not clear. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, in fact, it would have been in the medical literature had he had one, because this doctor always published his science. So I looked around like one does in those, we already had the internet and all. So I spent about a year searching to find out whether there was any trace of what happened to JP. And I found a talk given by a neuroradiologist in a medical meeting in Kentucky in the United States, talking about some famous cases that he knew about. And in one of the cases, it was clearly he was talking about JP as one of them. He happened to mention that he was present at the brain cutting, which is what we call the autopsy of the brain. And unfortunately, his name was two single syllable names, John Rice. And I then went through directories of people named John Rice in the state of Kentucky, and it took a while and called various ones that were the wrong person. And finally found him, and then gradually was able to find all of the people that were present at this brain cutting. And what I really wanted to do was to find the brain myself, and then we could study it in our neuropathology laboratory, because this is such a well-described case that it would become, if we could study the brain, it would become the most detailed lifelong description of what it's like to grow up without a prefrontal cortex. And it would be one of nature's greatest experiments in a way, if we could describe what we knew about this person from birth to death and what the brain looked like. So I knew it was an important case, and I thought maybe we can find it. And so we did detective work. We did a lot of traveling. I went to Kentucky. I'm in Massachusetts. I'm in Boston. So I flew down to the city of Louisville, Kentucky, and got to know some of the people there. At one point, had them all meet me at the University of Louisville, and we interviewed. I hired a video producer, and we interviewed each of them to see if they could help me figure out what became of the brain. Eventually, we found evidence of the brain cutting. So it was because I remember. It was because I remembered it from my training.
This is great. This is already a detective story. How researchers investigate cases, reinvestigate cases. But thank you for this story. But let's make a sum up for a broad audience. What GP had, when he first met Dr. Ackerley. So he had compulsive car stealing. He had problems with establishing permanent social contacts, but he had good memory actually. So he had excellent spelling. It seemed that he didn't had any intellectual impairment, and he had a habit of wandering for long distances. And this habit of wandering has started when he was about 4 years.
Two and a half.
Two and a half. But it's difficult to say whether it is normal or not, because children, especially very small children, kids, they like to go to investigate. They're curious. How was it possible to distinguish that it was already not normal behavior?
Well, let me tell you what his wandering was like when he was 2.5 years old. First of all, the reason this is interesting is because even in 1933, which was the year that Dr. Ackerley investigated this boy, basically it was to try to keep him from going to prison for stealing cars. His parents had hired a lawyer, and they found this doctor to try to do this. And they did the investigation one could do in 1933 to study the brain, but it was limited. They even did exploratory neurosurgery and were shocked to learn that there was almost no prefrontal cortex. On the right, none. On the left, very little. They didn't know what had happened, but whatever had happened early in life, and most likely during his delivery as a baby. But his face was normal. It didn't look like there was trauma. There was no bruises. He was normally formed. He looked like a completely normal boy. But at age 2.5, the wandering began. And this is, you tell me whether you think it's consistent with 2.5-year-old behavior. He would, when a door was left unlocked, he would open it and leave. He would walk up to a mile away from his parents' home in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, would be found by the police, and until the parents figured out to call the police, they wouldn't find him. And then they knew to keep the doors locked. But if ever like someone came to work in the house and didn't close the door behind them, this little boy would get out and he would wander long distances. But the police in Louisville got to know him, and they knew immediately to bring him back to this house. And the father tried to, even using punishment, with probably beating him.
Sure, that it is not good behavior, yes.
Right, and it had no effect whatsoever on him. He just wandered. So one of the things we know about the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the parietal lobes are that if your prefrontal cortex is not working, your parietal lobes want to reach out and explore. And so what you find with, say, an elderly person with a frontal dementia, they will have what's called a forced grasp. They'll grab on to you. And they will, when something comes into view, it's a visually disinhibited grasp. If they see something, they reach for it and take it. That's an example of what happens when the frontal lobes are not working and the rest of the brain is working. And I think that was part of JP's wandering. He would see things and just go. Fortunately, he never got seriously hurt by doing this, but he would do it over and over. And his parents had to learn to always watch where he was, because he would escape and do this. So is that a 2.5-year-old normal behavior? I'll leave it to your listeners.
This is a very good point. Thank you. So can you say that this is so-called stimulus-bound behavior? So that we have a stimulus and the person cannot explain why he or she does it, just he or she acts.
Exactly. So stimulus-bound behavior is one of the characteristics of prefrontal dysfunction. It's also the characteristics, though, of children until they fully myelinate their prefrontal cortex. So some of you probably were once in high school, and you might remember the 9th grade compared to the 11th grade. And in 9th grade, boys whose prefrontal cortex has not yet myelinated as fast as girls will get in trouble by saying things out loud that they should keep to themselves. And the teacher will put them in the corner of the room or something because they're disinhibited, right? But the girls are already myelinating, and they write, we're on to you. We know what girls do. They write little tiny notes, fold them up very small, pass them to the girl in the next row. They never get caught by the teacher. The boys do. They're not so it's a kind of stimulus-bound behavior. You see something and you say something right away.
And impulsivity, does it have some links to this behavior? Because for me, this is a big question, because at some point impulsivity can be like a personal trait, but also this parameter, I know that it quite oftenly seen in some psychiatric reports and so on, and assessments. So when impulsivity is a normal behavior and when it is a mark that something wrong is happening with a person.
Yeah. Well, the last part of your question is difficult to draw a clear line, but the first part is what is impulsivity? So the parts of the prefrontal cortex working with a few other parts in the brain generate a cognitive pattern that we call executive function. And executive function is basically the collection of things that your brain can do to anticipate what the problem is or what you need to do. Make a plan, carry out the plan in the right order, kind of watch to see how well it goes, and then do it better the next time. And no matter what you're trying to do, no matter if you are trying to, say, get into a master's program, or whether you're trying to be the person in charge of an automobile manufacturing company, or trying to become a doctor, the better your executive function, the better you do in your pursuit of goals. And so impulsivity has to do with not anticipating the outcome of the behavior, right? It's almost the opposite. So rather than thinking, if I do this, then this will happen, then this will happen, then maybe, impulsivity has to do with cutting that short and just making a choice to do a behavior because it occurs to you, and without considering the consequences. So it's a little bit like the inverse of executive function. But your second part of the question, when's it normal? Well, if you are going to be a comedian, for instance, you need to kind of look around and respond to the last thing you heard and come up with an unexpected response. The unexpected is humorous, right? And you have to do it quickly. Now, I don't know, I think it's a learned behavior, so it's not entirely an impulse, because a comedian knows what to expect when they say certain things. But maybe someone who's just a friend of yours, not a professional comedian, but always seems to have the right thing to say quickly, so socially acceptable impulsivity, except that I think those people have quickly considered what's the outcome, and they still won't say something that insults you or makes you feel badly. They just quickly come up with a response. I think they're just very quickly thinking through the executive outcome of whatever they're doing.
So it's not just a hyper-emotional person, so impulsive person. It's not hyper-emotional. This is, it relies on different mechanisms of anticipating of things, right?
You could say that, but the problem is that if you use the term hyper-emotional, which, we don't use that in psychiatry, but if I think of somebody with a mood disorder who is impulsive, I would think of somebody with bipolar disorder, manic depressive illness. And when they're manic, they're fully disinhibited and do not consider the outcomes of their actions. And they get into terrible trouble, which is the main dysfunction in this disorder, is if you're not on a medication to control the mood swings, you can do impulsive things that are just very dangerous. Like, it seems like a good idea to get on a skateboard and go off the roof, or drive a car at 200 kilometers an hour on a city street, or you make terrible decisions that end up hurting people or yourself. That's a kind of, you could call that hyper-emotionality, I suppose, because it's a mood that is exaggerated and brings with it impulsivity. So, and when you study those sorts of mood disorders, what do you find? Frontal dysfunction.
Great. So, but again, example from just common life. Teenagers, we can see that they can be quite impulsive. And with time, with aging, they start to control themselves, and this impulsivity is going away. Uh, is it linked somehow with I don't know, hormonal bursts and hormonal effects on the development of the frontal lobe?
I don't know whether or not it's linked to hormonal effects. However, it is linked to myelination of the frontal lobe. And it's so well known that automobile insurance companies, at least here in the United States, I don't know how they are in Germany, but the automobile insurance companies will charge a different rate to insure someone who's 18 years old driving a car from someone who's 20, from someone who's 25 years old. And the insurance companies understand this concept of myelination. They even say it. They say that we know that the prefrontal lobes are not fully developed until young adulthood. We charge more because we know that you are more likely to get in an accident by not considering the long-term consequences. Executive dysfunction. But it's normal development of executive function.
Coming back, so all roads lead to frontal lobes. Coming back to GP case, I think that we should mention that he was not an aggressive patient. He was an extra polite person, and unfortunately, he was beaten quite often by his classmates, and accurately described him as a defenseless patient. Can you comment how it happened that his asocial behavior was not antisocial behavior?
So this is, it's a great question. Like, what is antisocial behavior? Maybe you could call it asocial behavior, because antisocial, usually when we talk about antisocial behavior, we're discussing perhaps someone who is trying to get things for themselves without any consideration for other people, and in fact, taking advantage of other people. So someone who convinces elderly people to give them their life savings and they'll get them a great reward for it and then steals it, you know. They're clearly doing this for their own benefit. Or someone who becomes a serial killer because they like the feeling of killing people and controlling other people. Those are antisocial and they're violating laws. So why did JP steal cars? Well, I don't know that we went into all of the details in the paper that you clearly have read very carefully. A lot of you got it right there. And I commend you for making it through that paper. It's fairly long. But his father sold automobiles back in 1912. He was born in 1912, and when JP was a little boy, his father sold automobiles. He sold a British car called the Austin, and he sold another car, an American one, or it might have been a German American one. It's called the Durand, and they were really kind of fancy cars you'd tour around in, brightly painted. And so what did JP do? When he was a teenager in high school, he began to look for shiny cars that had the keys in the ignition and were unlocked. He would never break a window. He would never open the lock. He would never, use a screwdriver or something to make the car go. He would just look for some in the 1920s and 30s. People didn't have to worry about car theft. It was pretty uncommon. And so he would just look for a car that was unlocked with keys. He would drive it as far as the petrol lasted. And then he would go in the same direction. He would never turn. He actually used a compass to keep going east if the car faced east. And then he would get someplace, he'd run out of fuel, park the car, and he would find a telephone and call his mother back in Louisville, Kentucky, and say, "Mom, I did it again. I took another car." His father had enough money to pay off the owner of the car, to keep them from going to the police and pay all the expenses. And then they would come and get him and bring him home. And he did this over and over and over again. But he wasn't going to sell the car. He wasn't trying to get someplace that he needed a car. He simply saw a shiny car that reminded him of his father's cars that he used to sell, and would take off and would go in the direction the car was facing. It was entirely stimulus bound, entirely. First, the stimulus was the appearance of the car, like a little boy, sort of a shiny toy. And then he was in the car and he loved the feeling of driving it. And that was a stimulus for him. And then he would go in the direction that he saw, which.
And he didn't plan where to go exactly. He just, yes.
Not at all.
This is
not at all. Didn't matter. He just loved to be behind the wheel of a car. The other thing about him that's different than antisocial is that he truly was transparent. He would tell you exactly what he was thinking. He wasn't dishonest. If you asked him, "Did you steal the car?" He'd say, "Well, yes." "Well, are you sorry about it?" He says, "Well, now that you caught me, I am." But
during the process,
he's not going to lie. I have a video recording I made with the daughter of Dr. Ackerley, who is still living. She was in her 80s when I made the video. And she tells a story of when she was 13 years old, she would go to her father's office because her father's secretary was giving her lessons on the typewriter. And so she was coming out of the office, going down the steps from the hospital when JP was coming to see her father and going up the steps. And he stopped. They talked for about 2 minutes and he complimented her and said some very nice things about her father, and because he loved her father, and then asked her to marry him.
Yes.
So she was 13 years old.
Very honest. Yeah.
And he was by then in his 20s, I think. So he also had a very good relationship with Dr. Ackerley, not like an antisocial. You know, I've seen a number of antisocial patients because of my field, and I would never invite one to my home.
This is very interesting point, because I read a book about psychopaths, and actually the question, is there any difference between anti-social people and psychopaths?
Well, two different types of terminology. Psychopathy is a term that psychological researchers use when they're studying people who have, who do behaviors that are widely regarded as being antisocial, but they call that psychopathy. But in psychiatry, psychopathy is not a diagnosis. So antisocial behavior is. Psychopathy is a research construct. And antisocial behavior reflects various personality traits. But this young man, JP, was welcome in the Ackerley household. He would come over and say, "Could I see the doctor?" And everybody in the family knew him, and he was very charming. Antisocial people can be very charming too, but they're very charming in order to take advantage of you.
Yes, this is a big difference.
Their charm. JP was just charming. He had no problem getting jobs. He would get hired immediately because he was extremely ingratiating. His Dr. Ackerley originally described his behavior as being Chesterfieldian, which is named after, I think, an 18th century British diplomat, Lord Chesterfield, who was said to be the epitome of the perfect diplomat. He knew exactly what to say, but he also was witty, and he was the diplomat's diplomat. So little JP, when he was caught, would always be extremely polite to adults. "How are you feeling?" And "Oh, you look so nice today." He would say things like that, even though he was a little boy. And so he would get jobs easily, but he never was able to keep a job more than a few weeks because someone would ask him to do two things at once. So he was working, for instance, in a petrol station, and People drive, this is back in the 1930s. Someone brings their car in and says, please fill it. In those days, there were actually people in the station who filled the car and then would even clean your car, and they would check the oil. They would do it. So someone would, while he's filling the car, they would say, could you check the oil? He would lose his temper and say, can't you see I'm doing something? I can't possibly stop and do something else right now. He would get incensed, and then he would get fired because of that. So that is very common in a lot of different brain dysfunction, the inability to do two things at once, so-called divided attention. And because of his problem with divided attention, he would always lose jobs. But he was able to get surprising jobs for somebody with no prefrontal cortex. He got a job as an ambulance driver. He got a job as a truck driver. He got a job as a hospital orderly, mostly because he could take the interns' white coats, borrow a stethoscope and put it in his pocket and pretend to be a doctor. He would get jobs and then be thrown out very quickly.
Can we say that almost 20% of his brain was absent because of this damage to the prefrontal lobe? Because when I saw pictures, I found a huge cyst, actually. There was a huge cyst, and this cyst was growing with the age of GP, and also it exhibited some pressure on other regions, and these regions were deformed by the end. And also one of the consequences of this damage was that the connection between two hemispheres was also impaired. So it was very thin, or in some places it was also absent. Probably it was also the reason why he couldn't do two things together, because if you need to combine different actions, you also need to have this interconnection of your two hemispheres. And when you have this abruption of this link, it also can cause this impairment in behavior.
Okay, well, I'll say I don't know what percentage of his brain was destroyed. I can show you a picture if you'd like to see. And I also don't know that it's the interhemispheric white matter connections that give you the ability to do two things at once. I don't know that we know that. Almost any brain damage, at least in the anterior forebrain, will cause you to have this common problem. Say after a traumatic brain injury, it's very, very common to not be able to focus on two things at once. What's the most common way that we do two things at once? We have music playing while we're cleaning the dishes after dinner, or while we're doing something for school. Everyone does that, except people who've had a traumatic brain injury or brain damage. They just can't. And you'll see a parent who's just cleaning the dishes, like you almost don't even need to be awake to do that. You do it so easily. And yet tell the child, can you please stop doing that? I can't concentrate. Concentrate on washing the dishes? But it's two things at once.
It's work, yes.
Any brain damage will, to my knowledge, any would do. If you like, I can show you the brain. I think I can do that. I can't do the audio, but I can show you would you like me to do that, or would that be too?
Yes, it would be nice, because you can use this share.
Yeah, I don't want to upset people who are watching, who've maybe never seen a brain. So what do you think? Is it okay?
It's okay.
All right. So here, I'll share my screen here, window, PowerPoint. Okay. There it is. Whoop, it's coming. Hang on. So there it is.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's see here if I can. You can see my mouse moving?
No.
How about now? Can you see the mouse moving?
Now, yes.
Okay. So what we're looking at are coronal slices of the brain. So if you think of the brain, consider a loaf of bread and how you slice it, right?
Yes,
Those
yes.
are coronal slices of a loaf of bread, right? So these are coronal slices of a brain. And you can tell where you are in the brain by what you see here. So here in the back, you see the temporal lobes when you go farther back in the brain, right? And you see some temporal lobes here in the middle, but towards the front of the brain is just the beginning of a temporal lobe. It's mostly prefrontal. So this is the far prefrontal area. In this particular case, I have the brain is photographed so that the right side is truly the right. So it's the right side of the brain. And you can see this thin ribbon of surviving brain around a gigantic hole where there should be prefrontal cortex. By the way, the term prefrontal, we mean all of those parts of the frontal lobes that are anterior to the motor strip. Because when the motor strip's affected, you have a weak arm or weak leg, sometimes if it's in the middle, but there's no weakness. He has no motor weakness. This is all anterior, in front of the motor parts of the brain. Completely gone on the right, but with a large hole on the left. And as we move backwards, you can see that this hole in the right goes almost all the way up to the edge of the prefrontal cortex here. And on the left side, there's a fairly large area. And then as you go back, you see that this is what is supposed to be the ventricles,
Yes.
of the brain with cerebrospinal fluid. Normally, they are about equal on the two sides, and so it's still very large here. So I don't know what, in this particular slice, this is 50% of this slice. But in this slice, it's, I don't know, 15% or 10% of this slice. So I don't really know what percentage of the brain it would be. I can also show you a picture, I think, of what it looked like on the outside.
Yes, it will be great. Anyway, Dr. Benjamin, thank you for showing this, because now, it is clear, even for non-professional people, not from neuroscience or psychiatry, that first of all, the patient had a very strong asymmetry of his brain. Yes, he had impaired the frontal part of his brain. And what is very important, that this is the most evolutionarily new part in the brain. So can we say that this part of the frontal lobes actually makes us humans?
I think that's very well stated. As a matter of fact, it's known as neocortex, meaning it's new cortex. And in general, in evolution, we think of the hindbrain, the brainstem, as being kind of in common with reptiles, and the limbic system, sort of in the middle of the brain, being in common with ancient mammals and old monkeys and things, and then newer monkeys and newer mammals having a neocortex, the front part, and only humans having this huge prefrontal cortex. And you could say that this part of the brain has a lot to do with consideration of others when you make a decision, has a lot to do with anticipating what will happen if you do something. Those are all human characteristics. Has a lot to do with the ability to sustain a relationship with another human being, another thing of what you just said, what makes us human. It has a lot to do with our ability to work together and succeed at a goal. So we can get together, build a city, get together, make a product, and we can do things for the good of other people. All of those things require prefrontal cortex. So yes, it's extremely important. And the reason that this JP case is so interesting is it gives us the ability to look at someone who grew up all the way, and we were able to find records all the way until his death, of what his life was like without prefrontal cortex. So that helps us know all of these things about what the prefrontal cortex does for us, what its role is.
This is an unbelievable story, because again, for me, it is still shocking that he he seemed quite intellectual person. Like he had IQ about 100 when he was young. And with time, unfortunately, his IQ started to drop, and the situation was worsened for him. So does it mean that this cyst continued to grow? And if, for example, in modern days, if you meet this person or this child with the same damage, is it possible to help this child and to stop these processes?
Well, I would argue that he was helped because he had an extremely caring relationship with his doctor. And I think that saved his life. That Dr. Ackerley's taking care of him like he did, I think prevented him from dying in prison, which would have, I'm sure, happened, because what would have happened, he would have gone to prison if Ackerley wouldn't have shown the court why he did these things. In prison, he would have been impulsive, and he would have probably said the wrong thing to the wrong person and ended up killed in prison.
Yes.
And so you could argue that he did get very good care. But one difference, one difference is it's not the cyst that grew. The cyst was, I think, the same size all of his life. If you like, I can show you a picture in a minute of it. But he developed progressive hydrocephalus, meaning that the ventricular system, where the CSF is enlarged as he got older. And probably this had to do with the gradual impact of the fluid in the cyst compressing the structures that would have continued flow of the fluid in the brain. And probably it compressed white matter that led to some memory problems and things. So I think it wasn't the cyst so much as the effect of the cyst. If you like, I can show you what the cyst looked like on his brain.
Yes, I would like so. Thank you.
If the people watching are not already ill from seeing the previous section.
Yes, exactly. Let's select the bravest one.
Here, 1 second, I go. All right.
But I mean, is it possible to make a surgery, for example, and to cut this cyst and to at least diminish this pressure somehow?
Oh, absolutely. Nowadays, we put in a shunt from the ventricles. It's a small plastic tube that the neurosurgeon will insert into the ventricles, and that will be threaded out through the bone, out through the cranium, through the scalp, down the neck, underneath the skin, all the way down into the peritoneum, the cavity in your abdomen where all of your organs sit. And they will just allow the fluid to come down into there. And you can even program it to say how much fluid can be allowed to come down. And that would have prevented him probably from getting so bad. However, it was a shunt that eventually did him in as well. So it's complicated. In 1977, we didn't have programmable shunts. The shunt is the tube that comes down. It was just an open tube. Nowadays, we can control the flow through it, and we could have kept him going and improved him. But he died in 1977, and this began happening in the 1930s probably. And then there was no such possibility, so it couldn't have been done. I'll show you the brain here, I think.
This is great. So
here
now people have much more possibilities to survive and to cope with this problem.
So we did succeed, obviously, in finding evidence of brain cutting. These are high quality photos that were taken at the time of his autopsy, and I was able to get them. So this is looking down from above on the brain. This is the right side. This is the left side. And this is where his prefrontal cortex should be. You can see the division here. You can see his motor strip right here. And then this is the cyst. From the side, this is what the cyst looked like.
Great.
Okay. But these, normally the brain isn't scooped out like this. See how it's kind of convex here? It's, or rather concave. It's scooped out looking. This brain should go in a round fashion. It should go all the way to here, but it's not. And so what those are is, unfortunately, the months before he passed away in Louisville, he came into the hospital with an unsteady walk. His feet were too far apart, and he was irritable. He was losing his temper more and yelling a little bit, not some. And he also had trouble controlling his bladder, his urine. And when you see those things together, it's associated with a condition called normal pressure hydrocephalus. And so if we saw that in someone who otherwise had a normal brain, but for this, we would probably put a shunt in, drain the fluid, and try to improve their walking and their urine control and all that. In this case, in 1977, they didn't have the programmable shunt. So what happened? He has a massive hydrocephalus and a massive cyst. They put a shunt into it, and it drained pretty huge amount of fluid, and the brain collapsed. And so this is the collapsed brain on both sides from taking a lot of fluid out. Nowadays, this wouldn't happen. So this area, once it collapsed, it filled in with blood. And that then kept the brain collapsed. It's called a subdural hematoma. And probably that's what ultimately did him in. So that is
the end. Anyway, his story contributed a lot in the modern to modern medicine and to neuropsychiatry. This is, I think, in a way, this is a great path.
Well, it probably did contribute. However, it was sort of forgotten. There have been about 10 well-reported cases of severe childhood frontal brain damage. And I've seen some myself. There's one from Brazil. There's a few in the United States. There's, I think, one in Europe. And they were well reported. And in a few of the papers, they say this is similar to what Ackerley reported in his patient JP. So those researchers know about it. But I think that, say, a child psychiatrist who sees the impact of poor frontal function in children, I don't think most child psychiatrists know about this case. I don't think most psychiatrists know, and I don't think most neurologists know about it because it's long been forgotten. It's from the 1930s. And so the reason that we wrote the paper that we did was to bring this case back and have it available as an example of what happens if you grow up without frontal lobes, without cortex.
Thank you very much. I have the next question. So, as I know, all charges were dropped off when Dr. Ackerley proved that GP has had severe problems with his brain. And I have a question concerning this. Where is this red line in criminal prosecution and criminal psychiatry when we can decide that person is responsible for his action or when he is not responsible for his action?
Yeah, you ask difficult questions, don't you? I think you have to start with what was the crime, right? In this case, the crime is taking cars, not hurting them, but taking them, and then the people got reimbursed by the family, and then they came back. So you look at that, right? On the other hand, you also see people with brain damage who commit crimes of violence. And sometimes there's a researcher who's quite good named Adrian Rain, who has studied the brains of violent criminals in prison and has demonstrated problems with frontal subcortical networks. But they won't, not that they have a hole in their brain like JP did, but just with subtle neurophysiological tests, you can show dysfunction in the networks. So you could say that people who commit certain crimes, their brains don't work like other people's. And so then the question is, what does one do with those? So in the case of somebody, say, with poorly functioning frontal lobes, what's the best thing for society? Even if, doesn't matter if they're responsible for their actions or not, where are they going to go where it keeps everybody safe? Well, you could argue that because of the way you interact with the world when you have poor frontal function, and you're very sometimes quite concrete, you don't think about abstract and long-term consequences, you could argue that the safest place for them to be is in jail, where they're not going to get out and hurt people, right? Even though the cause might be an abnormal brain. On the other hand, I have a lot of trouble with the idea of executing someone who might have had an abnormal brain that contributed to their behavior. I don't have as much of a problem with keeping that person in prison because I think they're not going to hurt people. With JP, he ended up living in a nursing home when he was older. He ended up living with his mother until he was in his 50s. And then in 1974, because of a big storm that destroyed their house, his mother moved him with her into a nursing home together. And he ended up dying in a nursing home. He wasn't hurting anybody. He had stopped stealing cars when he was probably in his 30s, or late 30s by then. He basically just stayed home. He didn't really go out. He didn't do anything that would draw attention to himself. Didn't even eat regularly. And he wasn't hurting society. But the decision as to whether someone is responsible for their actions has to do with doing careful study of, did they understand what's the consequence of the action? Did they make a decision by thinking through, what if I do this? What if I don't do this? Do they have executive function, right? And then did they have something wrong with their brain that caused them temporarily not to be able to consider those things? So for instance, if someone is mentally ill with something called psychosis, and they're actively hearing voices and actively have thoughts that make no sense about what's causing what, they're paranoid, temporarily, well, during that period, it's possible that an expert forensic psychiatrist might say they're not responsible for their actions during that period. But then the question is, what happens after that period? Are they then aware? Are they likely to do it again? Are they not likely to do it again? It's very complicated. So
predict it and how to safe. I had a question about exactly these people who actually do some violent actions on purpose. So I'm talking about antisocial people, and one of the reasons I read about is that this psychopathic or antisocial behavior is related with lack of oxytocin in the frontal lobe. So
lack of
so oxytocin.
Oh, oxytocin. Oh, okay.
Yes. Sorry, I corrupted this poor word.
I got it. Yeah.
So oxytocin, this is one of neurohormones, which actually has many roles, but one of the role is to establish social contacts and to be able to be empathic. So, and I read about some cases where people were neglected by their mothers during the first months of their development. And these months are very critical because when a child has a contact with his mother, then this machine of oxytocin release starts to work. And when the child doesn't have this contact, then this person will have impaired oxytocin release, and as a consequence, impaired ability to establish social contacts, to trust people, and to be empathic. So, coming back to psychopaths, how psychiatrists do evaluate them? For example, if you find this person, and generally these people are very smart because they develop during all his life with this abnormality, they understand that they are different, and they learn how to hide their initial impulses and how to lie to people and how to charm them. So what do psychiatrists do with them?
Okay, so first of all, oxytocin is one story, but it's not the only story. So oxytocin sometimes is called the cuddle hormone or the love hormone or something. Mm-hmm. And there are studies of you can squirt some oxytocin into the nose of a partner and suddenly they want to hold each other, and want to be close. So there is some evidence that oxytocin draws people together. On the other hand, there's other experiments with animal models as well that have different, they look at different aspects of what you described about the mother and the child. In rats, for instance, looking at the stress hormones, cortisol, for instance. Cortisol is the hormone that we all secrete when we're frightened and when we're under stress or whatever frightens someone. And the little rat, so if you look at a mother rat who takes care of a little rat pup, the way they take care of them in the rat world is called licking and grooming. The mother licks the face of licks the little rat and is constantly doing something with their fur, That's a way of demonstrating the mother's caring in the rat world. And if you have a mother who doesn't do that, because you can create a rat that does not do that.
Genetically modify it, yes, exactly.
Then the rat pup grows up to be irritable and to be unable to do that for their offspring. And they grow up in a way, I wouldn't want to describe a rat as antisocial, but they grow up to have behavioral abnormalities that have to do with not having had this attention. And those abnormalities have to do with how stress hormones are handled. And to a certain degree, there's some sex hormones involved as well. So it's not just oxytocin. It's a more complicated story of cortisol and the releasing hormones that release the cortisol. It's a more complicated story than that. So, but I can tell you when psychiatrists are evaluating somebody with antisocial behavior, they are not measuring brain chemistry. Usually they're not checking hormone levels. And probably they should do a neurological examination. And if there's any abnormalities on the cognitive or neurological examination, they probably should look at the brain just to make sure that there's not some sort of old brain injury. No one will ever have this level of injury, but that JP had, but something dysfunction. They probably should look in that case. They should first examine the patient though, and see if there's anything wrong, because if someone's antisocial and the neurological exam is completely normal and the cognitive examination is completely normal, you're not going to find anything when you do the imaging. And a mistake that people think is that sociopaths are not empathic. They're extremely empathic. They know, they know exactly how you will feel in a given situation. They appreciate when you'll be frightened and when you'll be trusting. they know you very well. And that ability is what they use, right? So
Yes.
the parts of their brain that can empathize with the situation of another person seem to work, but
Great.
they're used for another purpose.
Deadly attractive.
Yeah, good.
So the last very difficult question. So as we talked initially, originally I'm from Russia. So part of my family is from Ukraine. So 2 years ago, my country attacked another my country. And when I recovered after first shock, I started to think how to prevent it, how to stop these people who decided to kill massively other people. And I came to the idea that we lack any control actually of people who are planning, who are who are competing or go into the government or who want to be a president. So I started to think that probably residents, to create an assessment or test for all candidates to sort out all psychopaths, all people with psychosis, with manias, with severe personality disorders, and something like this. Because I think until it's not possible to have healthy conditions in your country when this country is ruled by psychopathic or antisocial people. I think it is not possible. That this is my personal subjective but still conclusion. So my question to you, is it possible to make this as blind as possible and as objective as possible assessment for candidates?
This sounds like the plot of a science fiction novel. I'm sure that there would be a bad outcome in any way you do it. I would suggest that perhaps if people in the country were less frightened of the outcome, that they do have the power to change leaders. And we're not mentioning the leader that you're describing, but so consider this though: who will run for office? Who will compete for a political office? Are you going to run for president? Why not? Why not?
Don't tell it Putin, please. I will not live for a long time.
Right, but who is it that will decide to try to convince other people that they are the ones that should be trusted, that they have the answer? Mm-hmm. You have to have a certain amount of narcissism to run for office.
Wow.
And you have to have a certain amount of aggression to succeed, even in what you're doing, right? You apparently have created a vodcast, and you have to decide to, I suppose, to tell people about it, to to assert yourself. The degree of success you may have in this will have to do with how assertive you are, probably. Mm-hmm. If you just were passive and didn't initiate any behaviors about it, you're probably not going to succeed. Someone who runs for a political office and wants to have posters of themselves all over the country, and they have to have a certain amount of narcissism to succeed. I'm not sure that we would have any leaders if people didn't at least have some narcissism. Hopefully they don't have antisocial characteristics.
Yeah. So it means let's keep narcissistic people. Let's keep narcissistic people. Okay. But still, we need to do something with severe antisocial people, because it is very strange, because in Russia, before your employment, you have assessment by a psychiatrist always. Like when I worked as a chemist, I had it. So I went to psychiatrist, I make some test, and then he releases certificate that I'm normal, and if I'm normal, I go and work. If I'm not, I cannot compete for some positions, and I cannot work in some spheres. Fortunately, I was normal someday. But so it happens with everyone, like with chemists, with engineers, with managers, but not with president.
Well, first of all, I doubt whether those psychiatric examinations or psychological examinations actually make a huge difference. However, remember, this can be corrupted immediately. In the history of the former Soviet Union, the KGB, the secret police, employed psychiatrists to evaluate dissidents who were against the government of Leonid Brezhnev, for instance. There was a psychiatrist named Snezhnevsky who even designed a diagnosis called sluggish schizophrenia. And the main criteria were dissenting despite the fact that you might be arrested. So the psychiatrist or psychologist can be corrupted by the government.
I also have these concerns. I also have concerns about it, and I also thought like probably we should to make like random commission just the day before the examination, so it would be a surprise both for psychiatrists and for candidates. Still, I believe that there are some options, but
I'll tell you. I know it's getting late here. I'll tell you one small story. This has to do also with Russian history, but back under the Brezhnev regime, there were two people, an engineer and a psychiatrist. The engineer was Vladimir Bukovsky, and the psychiatrist was Semyon Gluzman, who was from Ukraine. He's still there, Kiev, actually. And they wrote a book, a little booklet called A Manual on Psychiatry for Dissidents. And in the book, it says how you should respond when the KGB psychiatrists ask you questions. Because if you respond this way, at least you'll be sent to prison and not to a psychiatric hospital, because it'll be much worse for you in the psychiatric hospital. And they then were arrested and given a 10-year sentence for writing this book. But if you were to design in your science fiction fantasy this ability to screen the candidates for president, it would become corrupted. Somebody would brief the candidates on how to answer the questions, and someone else would create a diagnosis that would exonerate them from being antisocial. It won't work.
But if we will apply, for example, EEG or all other modern techniques, not only just tests, not only just questioning, because this is quite old and conservative methods. They work, but still, if we need to do it as a routine analysis, think or measure some hormonal levels, I think there are some options. Like at least to sort out, I don't know, people with severe psychosis and like severe damage, or I don't know, dementia.
You could look at the recent history of the United States. And I won't say anything about, I don't know that our former president had any mental illness at all. I don't think he did. And I don't think he's demented. I don't think any of those things. But I'm relatively certain that a personality test would have shown perhaps at least narcissism and maybe pathological narcissism. It might have demonstrated some of these things. But I am completely 100% convinced that the voters would not have cared at all. And I don't think they care now. I'm sorry. It's science fiction.
Still, I will think about it.
It's science fiction.
Yes, probably I will just write a science fiction book. Yes.
Yeah, it will be a nice story.
So thank you very much, Dr. Benjamin. It was a pleasure to talk with you about very difficult questions. And like the final point of my podcast is, could you please say in 3 words, why did you come to neuropsychiatry? What did move you? What does it mean for you? Like 3 words.
Inspire neuropsychiatric inquiry.
Wow. Thank you. It's inspiring.
Thanks very much.